Danger at Diablo, Chapter 3. The words of this angry traveler struck Annie with shocking force. She gasped involuntarily as she realized that he was openly accusing her uncle of dishonesty. Tag turned to her with a puzzled frown. "What's he saying about Uncle Luke?" She shook her head at him and whispered, "Let's listen." Over at the counter, the tall superintendent was speaking quietly. "You've been talking to the wrong people in Diablo, mister. Sheriff McTavish is an honest man and a good law officer. Anybody that holds a job like his is bound to have enemies, even among the folk he does the most for." "Then why doesn't he jail some of those riffraff that infest his territory, like those two toughs that robbed me just now? Is he scared, stupid, or crooked himself?" The stout man was getting more sure of himself by the minute, as he saw approval in the eyes of several of his listeners. "I'll tell you what I think," he began. He stopped abruptly as he saw the look on Jim Castle's face. The tall man was looking at him with the expression of a St. Bernard dog watching a tumblebug, and with just as little respect. He flushed uncomfortably and held his tongue. "I don't know why I'm bothering to explain," Castle spoke slowly and carefully, weighing his words, "but you've got a wrong slant on things from somebody. This is a big stretch of country, and Luke's got just one regular deputy hired to help him. Those two can't be all places at once, but they do their all-fired best, and any honest citizen in this county will back me up on that." From her place by the fire, Annie studied the faces of the men at the counter. A couple of local men nodded agreement with the station manager, but others looked blank or turned away with an obvious attempt to avoid being drawn into the argument. It was plain to Annie that there was a difference of opinion here about Uncle Luke. A disturbing difference. She listened tensely as the pompous little man began to speak again. "The person who told me about McTavish happens to be a very substantial citizen of Diablo, and he says that either your sheriff is afraid to bring the law on the ruffians who've been robbing travelers like ourselves, breaking into your local bank and stealing mine payrolls from decent mine owners, or he's in it with them." Tag jumped to his feet and started over to the group. Annie caught his arm. "Wait," she warned him. "But Annie, didn't you hear what he said about Uncle Luke? I'm going to tell that mean old man." "Wait, honey, that won't help. Let's hear what Mr. Castle has to say to that." For a moment, Jim Castle was silent. The others watched him. When Castle spoke, it was with a good-natured chuckle. He even smiled down at the traveler. "Folks who spend a few days here and a few days there hear a lot of things. Sometimes they're true, other times they're just something spilled out of a bottle on a hotel bar." He turned and included them all in one broad gesture. "In any case, arguing about the sheriff won't get us anywhere tonight. It's time I was giving you folks a chance to turn in and get a good night's rest. Now, if you'll just sign your name and town in the book." He smiled as he pushed the register towards the nearest of the stage passengers. The stout traveler glowered, but as he was looking around for some encouragement to continue the argument, he saw that Castle had taken their minds off the subject. He might as well keep quiet. But he made a mental note that the stage company would get a letter from his lawyers, insurance or no insurance. He would collect plenty. Over at the fireplace, Tag grinned at his sister. "I guess that settles Mr. Big Talk." She nodded and smiled faintly. She was watching the little group of men break up. Some of them followed an old Mexican servant away toward the sleeping quarters down the hall. Others drifted out the front door. They were the hardy souls who lived in the open and scorned the confines of a room at the station. The sky was their familiar roof, and they preferred it so. Annie was troubled. Gossip or not, the salesman's angry words against her uncle remained in her mind and bothered her. She had never worried in all the long weeks of her journey with Tag to this new country that was to be their home. She had felt able to handle any situation that came up along the way, or to find a helping hand if it was too much for her alone. But the thought that her uncle might not be all she expected was a new and alarming one. She knew that her father had not seen Luke McTavish for years, probably not since her mother's funeral when Tag was a baby. She had only the dimmest remembrance of him there. His letter in answer to hers had been warm and friendly. He had assured her that she and Tag would be happy on his Bullseye Ranch. He had told them he would have a pony for Tag, and he was also buying a new wood stove from the mail-order catalog so that Annie would find the cooking easier. There had been nothing in his letter to hint that he did not really want them to come and make their home with him. If it was true, as the salesman had said, that he was friendly with outlaws, he certainly would not have invited them. They would be sure to get in the way. Or, Annie had a sudden sinking feeling, would he be able to fool people better if he had them living there? She felt that she must know more about Luke McTavish before she and Tag reached his ranch and settled into being his family. Come on. She pushed her wide-brimmed hat back off her forehead and picked up her saddle. Tag valiantly struggled with the carpetbags as they moved over to the counter. Let's find out where we sleep tonight, she said cheerfully. Looks like everybody else is taken care of. Jim Castle was alone behind the counter as they came up. He was startled to see a young girl and a sleepy-eyed boy. He had not noticed them before. Where on earth did you two kids drop from? He demanded. And where are your folks? He looked past them at the open door. Annie smiled and held out her hand. Our name is Oakley, she said. Castle looked puzzled, but he took the hand politely. Oakley, he repeated. There was something familiar about the sound of it. Oakley? He still held her hand absent-mindedly. Suddenly he gripped it harder and shook it vigorously. Why, sure, now I recollect. You must be Luke's kids that he's expecting. Annie and Tag Oakley. I'm Tag, and she's Annie. Tag pointed earnestly. I almost figured that out for myself. Jim Castle chuckled down at them, his long mustache dancing as his mouth widened in a friendly grin. I'm sure glad you got here. Luke's been fussing worse than an old bitty hen setting on a china egg because you took so long. I'm glad to know Uncle Luke has a friend like you, Mr. Castle, Annie spoke soberly. We heard what that man from the stagecoach was saying about him. Oh. Jim Castle hesitated the smallest fraction of a minute, but Annie noticed it. Tell you what I really think, he told her. That traveling man was most likely flashing his fat bankroll around in Diablo last night, and a couple of his so-called pals followed the stage and took it away from him. But he said the man he talked to about Uncle Luke was a prominent citizen. Castle laughed and dismissed the prominent citizen with a scornful wave of the hand. That might be true, too. There's a thing called politics that makes some folks run off at the mouth, and we're having an election soon, so don't pay any attention to that. Tag was rubbing his eyes sleepily. Annie put an arm across his shoulders. This colt needs a place to bed down, Mr. Castle. If you'll tell me where to put him, I'll be much obliged. I can give you a couple of rooms on the side away from the stables. He watched her sign the register. I figured 2 of them for that traveling salesman, but I changed my mind when he started blowing off about Luke. I gave him one on the side with the flies. He won't get much sleep after daybreak. Chuckling, he led them down the corridor to their rooms, followed by the old Mexican servant with their bags and Annie's saddle. The tiny rooms were only a few feet square, but they had good pole beds, laced with thick strips of rawhide and raised off of the hard dirt floor. The guest was supposed to supply his own blankets, as well as a luxury item called towels, but there was a strong roof overhead and a warmth that still lingered inside the thick adobe walls, a reminder of the desert day just past and the one to come. We'll be pulling out early in the morning, Annie told Jim Castle. I want to get to Diablo before dark. Well, now, he patted Tag's sleepy head. I don't guess you'd better, Miss Annie. I'll send word to Luke you're here, and in a couple of days he'll come get you. It won't hurt the young'un here to have a bit of rest. Annie started to protest, but the superintendent didn't wait to listen. He said good night to them briefly and went out, closing the door. Off to bed you go, she told Tag cheerfully. Without protest, he took the lighted candle she gave him and went to his room. A few minutes later, she heard the pole bed squeak and saw that the candle was out. As soon as she was sure he was asleep, she tiptoed in and tucked the blanket securely around him, touched his forehead lightly with her lips, and then stole out. Later, while Tag slept soundly, she sat for hours staring out through the narrow loophole windows in the thick adobe wall of her room, thinking over what she had heard about her uncle and trying to decide what it would be best to do. Across the moon-drenched stillness of the desert, she heard a coyote howl mournfully. Nearer at hand, as if in answer to his challenge, the horses snorted and stomped in the stables. Her candle was burning low in the wall. Some tiny animals scuttered across the floor with the faintest of sounds. Annie drew her feet up and clasped her hands around her knees. Rattlesnakes, flash floods, and the other hazards of the open road she could face, but not mice. Definitely not mice. A tiny breeze flickered the flame of the candle. Outside, the stars were still bright in the night sky, but Annie knew that dawn was close. Suddenly, she made up her mind. They would not wait for Jim Castle to send word to Uncle Luke that they were here. They would leave for Diablo before Jim Castle was awake. She must meet Uncle Luke without letting him know that she and Tag had arrived. She wanted to surprise him, catch him off guard. It would give her a better chance of finding out what sort of man he really was, and what kind of a home she was bringing Tag into. The superintendent had seemed honest and sincere, and she hoped desperately that what he had said about politics and Diablo was the answer. But it was her responsibility to make sure before she and Tag were committed to staying. She stepped down from the bed gingerly with a cautious eye for the long-gone mouse. The sky outside was starting to turn gray. She must wake Tag quietly, poor lamb, and they must be on their way before Jim Castle woke and tried to argue her out of it. Long fingers of dawn were reaching across the sky to the east as Annie and Tag tiptoed out of the headquarters building with their carpet bags and Annie's saddle. Annie had left the payment for their rooms on a counter in the envelope addressed to Jim Castle, with a short note telling him that she had decided not to bother her uncle by bringing him all the way from Diablo to meet her and Tag. A surprised and sleepy stable hand helped them harness up, and, for an extra dime, opened the station gate for them. Annie rode out first on target, and Tag brought up the rear with the wagon. She hoped uneasily that the rumble of the wheels and the squeak of the ungreased axles would not arouse Jim Castle and bring him out, too. Her mind was made up, and she was doing what she thought was best for Tag and herself, and arguing about it would do no good. She sighed with relief as the heavy gate closed behind them, and she heard the iron bar drop back into place. So far, so good. The air was still filled with the coolness of the night, but Annie knew that the moment the sun rose it would be uncomfortably warm. There was a long road ahead through the rocky, treeless wasteland, and it was too much to hope that there would be a desert spring with its welcome greenness along the way. So, while traveling was still pleasant and easy, she set a rapid pace with Target, and they rolled merrily along. It was less than an hour later that Annie, riding along at the side of the still briskly rolling wagon, thought she saw a wisp of smoke up ahead among the giant boulders that lined the narrow road. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone from sight. She squinted her eyes and shielded them from the level rays of the rising sun. There was no more smoke. In fact, she reflected, it might not have been smoke at all, but a tiny whirlwind of sand blown unusually high. She threw a quick glance at Tag. He hadn't seen it. If it had been smoke, it was probably a prospector's campfire, and there was nothing to get alarmed about. Those road agents were miles away by now. She called over to Tag. If this map of Uncle Luke's is anywhere near right, we'll be at Diablo sometime this afternoon. Maybe we'll spend tonight on Uncle Luke's ranch. Tag was gleeful. And I'll meet my new pony. She nodded. Better be thinking up a name for him as we go along, she suggested cheerfully. That would keep his mind busy with something besides the possible dangers of the road ahead. But she was keeping her own rifle close at hand in the saddle scabbard, and her Colt hung loaded and ready at her side.